Hey everybody, it's episode 28. Today's question is, how do we know when we're living with an authoritarian leader? Happy New Year! Yay! We did it. We got rid of 2019. I'm sure 2020 is going to be so much better. Welcome to the Classroom of Life. That is Stand Up with Pete Dominic, where every episode of the podcast, I do my best to fight apathy and ignorance and learn together with you from our expert guests and other interesting and entertaining people about the issues and ideas that matter to you, your family, your community, country, planet, and your own personal well-being. Speaking of well-being, mine is not great. I've got a very bad head and chest cold situation that is kicking my ass. And before anybody offers with, I'm sure, good intentions, a remedy, I want you to save it. Save it! Tell your friends there's no remedy for a cold. You can't load up on vitamin C or echinacea or zinc or garlic or chicken soup or any of the rest of those BS ideas that emergency powder tastes good in a drink, makes you think you feel better, but none of them are proven to do anything. And you can't argue that there's a consensus on climate science or other sciences, but not on zinc. I've talked with Dr. Aaron Carroll about this plenty of times. The science is just not on the side of those things. They might have a placebo effect and make lots of money, but rest and hydration is the only answer, so I'm going to do that. And by the way, here's Dr. Aaron Carroll in his episode of Health Care Triage titled, Do any common cold remedies work? Probably not. Listen to him.
Of the herb, echinacea did no better than placebo for preventing or treating colds. In the best studies, which were randomized controlled trials, the majority of studies still found no benefit for echinacea in preventing colds. Studies done since then aren't any more convincing. In 2007, a group of researchers claimed that the evidence from 14 studies suggested that echinacea did shorten cold symptoms by a day or so. Unfortunately, other researchers claim that those scientists didn't combine the studies appropriately and that the results can't be trusted. Bottom line, even in the weakest studies, the evidence isn't really compelling. And let's face it, results from the better quality studies are more trustworthy. Those studies say that echinacea doesn't prevent or treat colds. Garlic. Taking garlic to prevent or treat colds requires some serious trade-offs. Is it better to smell terrible and be accused of excessive paranoia about avoiding vampires, or to have the occasional cough or cold? In a comprehensive review of scientific trials of garlic, only one of the 5 studies identified was of really high quality. In that study, 146 volunteers were randomly...
All right, that's garlic. Now he goes on with all the research there, but here's vitamin C for Dr. Carroll.
Vitamin C. On the other hand, there's been a lot of research on vitamin C. When researchers combine the results of 23 studies investigating whether vitamin C prevents colds in normal people, there's no significant improvement.
There you go. All right, there's more research, and you should watch the whole episode at Health Care Triage on YouTube. But let's get back to today's question and guest. Again, the question is, how do we recognize when we're living with an authoritarian leader? According to me, the rise of authoritarianism and the decline of democracy is the scariest trend happening in our world today, second only, of course, to the planetary climate crisis. Have you seen the images coming out of Australia? Oh my God, it's hell on earth down there. Very, very scary. We've got to do something about it. The Republican Party in America is the only political party in the world that doesn't buy, or they do, but they're just lying, which makes it even that much more insidious, the consensus on climate change. But back to authoritarianism. Some of you might argue we lost our democracy a long time ago. Some might say we never had it, but I thought I'd ask a scholar what she thought. Like many of you have been reading a lot about the rise of authoritarianism, and it's fascinating in terms of the history, and it's terrifying to see it coming back in the world, around the world, over the past few years. And while it's terrifying, I think it's really necessary for us to understand as best we can what is happening and why it is happening. I highly recommend the work of Timothy Snyder at Yale, Masha Gessen, Julia Ioffe, and of course my guest today, Ruth Ben Ghiat. I have a lot to say about this and a lot more that I wanted to share with you today, but I've got this awful head cold and I'm trying to get some rest. So let's get to my guest, Ruth Ben Ghiat, right now. All right, joining me now is an internationally renowned historian, speaker, and political commentator on fascism, authoritarian leaders, and propaganda. She's also a professor of history and Italian studies at New York University and an advisor to a really important, awesome organization called Protect Democracy. Ruth Ben Ghiat is joining me, and that's Benghiat. Ghiat, in case you want to look her up, and I hope you do, and follow her and get her books. Professor, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
I'm delighted to be here.
Do you ever wonder or wish that your expertise was not in so much demand in terms of commenting on the present day world?
Oh, very much so. It's never a good sign when, if you're an expert on fascism and authoritarianism, when your expertise becomes relevant. You would like it to be something in the past, especially the fascism part. And instead, you see it happening around the world and even in your own country, unfolding the very things that you've been studying for years.
I've been spending a lot of time with you in terms of preparing to talk with you, reading articles, watching some talks you gave. And so I saw you mention in a talk at one point that there is maybe a controversy or a question about a historian like yourself being a commentator or a pundit today, that historians should not be commentators. You addressed that in one talk, and so I thought that was a really good point that you and others have brought up. Why is it, do you think, appropriate for a historian to be a current times commentator?
That's a great question, and it's been very interesting for me to see that debate unfold. I was surprised, I guess, given what I study, I was surprised to even hear such objections made generally. And when I first started writing, it was for CNN in 2015 about our present, I would get emails sometimes from older historians saying this was unseemly, as one said, to be out there seeming to be partisan. And so the objection is, we're supposed to be objective. But I think it's a civic duty, and for me, it's a process of civic education, and I'm learning as well as I hope others are learning. I would be remiss not to put my training and expertise to public service if I see that it's of use.
Well, forgive me for not being smart enough to understand how a historian can be objective. But I mean, if you study history and then you see in present day some scenario playing out that you're an expert on, aren't you still being objective by commenting on, for example, the similarities that you're seeing, much less the differences?
Yeah, and the big question that this issue raises is it okay to, or is it appropriate to make analogies? So some of it is less about the fact that you go on TV or podcasts or write op-eds than the specific thing that perhaps somebody says that Trump's like Hitler or Orban in Hungary is like Hitler. And for the way that I approach that is I am very careful. I don't call Trump a fascist. I study fascism, and I believe that one-party dictatorship, we have that today in North Korea and communist China, but it's increasingly something of the past. And so I reserve the word fascist for the historical precedent, which doesn't mean that leaders today don't use a ton of fascist techniques. So that's the way I get around it, is that I make analogies, but I'm careful about the terms I use.
Authoritarianism, autocracy, dictatorship, fascism, for most of us who aren't experts, we kind of use them interchangeably. What do you think is most accurate to describe the current situation in the United States of America? Obviously, we can talk about Hungary with Orban. We can talk about Turkey with Erdogan, and we can talk about the rise of this type of governance and this type of persona, this cult that we see in different countries, and compare them. But let's just stick to America and President Trump now in terms of the terminology that you think is appropriate.
So what I'm doing, it really makes your head spin. And in researching this book that I'm finishing called Strongman, which is a history from Mussolini up to today's rulers, I've, of course, researched all these terms. And it's crazy the amount of terms that people find to refer to illiberal leaders. So the term I'm using is new authoritarians, which are the people of the 21st century, like Putin, Orban, and Trump, where they come to power with elections. So they're not military coups, they're not dictatorships. They allow elections. But in studying this, it's been really interesting and dismaying is that a lot of the tools of democracy, like elections, end up being manipulated, and new authoritarians use them to keep themselves in power. So they use the tools of democracy, like the free press, also to end up kind of discrediting or destroying democracy.
You've been studying this and writing about it a lot, about Italy and Mussolini and fascism for much of your career. Did you think that the ground was ever seeded in the United States of America for what we have now? Did you see this coming, the possibility of it coming? Because sometimes I think that Donald Trump is the only kind of person that could have pulled this off.
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't see it coming. And what's been super interesting for me is that I am not an American historian. I learned American history in school, but I've always done European history, and then through my studies of empire, also kind of global history, African history. And so I was not thinking that America would have this kind of ruler. And it really was seeing Trump come on the scene and doing exactly the things that I had, seen on films, on newsreels. I wrote, my last book was on fascist film. And so I saw Trump, a video of him at a rally, and I stopped in my tracks and I said, this is not good. With the loyalty oath and the lock her up, I thought, this is really something different. This is not another presidential candidate. And then he started with his violence, saying he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue. And so, by the time he got the nomination, it was very, very clear to me what was going on. But it was from observing the facts in front of me, what he was doing, what he was saying.
Yeah, I often hear you reference that moment where he said I could shoot somebody. Yeah. And so I grabbed that audio. It's always good to have good audio on a podcast. Let me just play this despicable comment and ask you to endure it, and we'll listen and then come back. This is from Iowa in January of 2016. So, of course, before the election, I guess he's campaigning in Iowa. I don't know if he said it other times. Here it is.
And you know what else they say about my people? The polls. They say, I have the most loyal people. Did you ever see that? Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay? It's like incredible. No, they say, Trump, we love you too, man. Trump's voters are by far, I'm at 68, 69%. I'm at 90% total. Like, will you say absolutely? I think it's 68 or 69%.
All right, that's enough. And I should mention that I have YouTube on speed and a quarter, 1.25, because I can't possibly endure him or anybody else talking too slowly. But so what is that moment for? Why do you often reference the I could shoot somebody and not lose voters moment?
Well, because first of all, this is not normal behavior for a political candidate. In fact, I can't think of anything more self-defeating and self-sabotaging than to come up and say, "Oh, hi, I could shoot someone." And of course, Fifth Avenue, he has this macho swagger, and Fifth Avenue is his like Wild West, street, and it's his fortress is Trump Tower. So
right.
there's this macho stuff going on, and this was very strange behavior for a democracy, but unfortunately, it's normal behavior for new authoritarians. So I thought, okay, Duterte in the Philippines when he was campaigning, he was talking about killing people. And he actually said to Filipinos, he said, "I warn you, don't vote for me, because if I win, it's going to be bloody." So I had that kind of frame of reference in mind, and I like all of us, I couldn't believe my ears and eyes. But and the other thing that really scared me was that he was basically saying that if you elect him, he considers himself above the law. So it's not just that he's capable of violence; he also thinks that he could get away with it.
Because he had for so long in the private sector. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's actually applying the things that he did, which is this kind of barely legal, often illegal way of doing business. And he's taking all of that and applying it to politics. So the thing about Trump is that he is who he is and he's never changed. And so the people who kept thinking he was going to pivot, that was the word that people used. And I was like tweeting, rage tweeting, saying he's not going to change people. This has happened over and over again. You're deluded. But, it's one voice crying into the wilderness and wilderness of Twitter.
Well, it's a great voice crying into the wilderness of Twitter, and everybody should follow you on Twitter because I get a lot out of your Twitter feed. I really appreciate your tweets. You also said, I've also seen you either write or talk about often you see authoritarians take power after a period of progressive success, or specifically after a period where historically discriminated or marginalized groups make advances. Women, minorities, religious, ethnic minorities make advances, have progress. It's reacted to negatively, and that's where you get a Trump or other place. Tell me where in history that's the case, and how you think that played out from, say, Obama to Trump.
Yeah, so this was something that came up. I knew it about the fascists, but when I did the research on how Franco came to power, or the conditions that allowed Franco to come to power in Spain, or Pinochet in Chile in 1973. So over and over, you saw that there had been these periods of great progress, whatever that meant in that culture. In America, it was, huge advances. Obviously, you had an African-American president in power for 8 years. You had same-sex marriages. You had all this social and racial justice processes that had made a lot of progress. And so over and over, what you see is that conservative elites are already very upset about this. Religious authorities can be upset about this. And then a certain kind of individual comes up, and perhaps they come up at all times, but in those moments when, let's say, white male anxiety is at its height, they find favor. And this kind of bargain between this individual and the elites, they may have nothing in common. Like Donald Trump and evangelical Christians is, you could say, the weirdest alliance ever, but not really. So that's what predisposes people to back these kinds of leaders, even though it's improbable.
What is that? And I think maybe did you say white evangelical Christians? Because there's a difference, right?
Yeah.
What is that relationship? I attribute it simply to, and please tell me if this is wrong, because I don't want to be disrespectful and I don't want to be wrong, more importantly, in my thinking. But this idea of, certainly very religious people not questioning authority and not using a certain sense of critical thinking, this idea of worshiping an entity, and even more recently, this very absurd moment, I think, line that we crossed where you saw Republican congressmen on the House floor comparing Donald Trump's persecution and impeachment to Christ's, and comparing Trump to Christ. What is it about white evangelical Christians or other religious people in other countries that attracts them to this type of new authoritarian or strongman?
That's a super interesting question. And some of it is a similarity in cultures, a kind of authoritarianism, as you said, a desire to believe in a scripture, and also to elevate someone to the position of savior. And they say that Trump is put there, like also, Sarah Sanders and Mike Pompeo and a lot of evangelical Christian important people in administration, past and present, have said he was put there for a divine reason.
Right.
He is the savior. He has a mission. And this you find from Mussolini on. Every single authoritarian leader, old and new, gets put in this kind of cast in this role of the savior of the nation. And once this narrative consolidates, it's really hard to get rid of it. And evangelicals, this is one thing I didn't know till I did the research on this book. Not only they supported Hitler, but also Bolsonaro is an evangelical Christian in Brazil. And so there's a kind of sub-theme of evangelical Christians and authoritarian leaders of a certain type of evangelical Christian.
That's very, I mean, I guess the easiest way to look at it is that he is the savior that they've been waiting for. But I guess I just don't understand what they think he is saving them from.
Well, a lot of this, if we step back, a lot of this is sheer political calculation. And you find with all kinds of religious institutions, starting with the Pope and Mussolini. Mussolini was a complete atheist. Mussolini was such an atheist that he had actually written a book in his youth about a cardinal of the Catholic Church who had a mistress. He was like not a friend of the church. And yet he was the one in 1929 who made peace with the Vatican. Church and state brought them together. And actually, if you go today to Rome and you go to Vatican City and it's its own sovereign state, that's why he did that. So you have these like alliances of calculation, and each one is going to get something from the other. And they really help, it hugely helps authoritarians to have religious institutions backing them because it gives them a moral legitimacy, which they need because they're the most corrupt people on the planet.
Do the people who support authoritarians throughout history, do they think that they also support democracy? Do they not understand democracy? Or do they openly despise the tenets of democracy that include free press, assembly, free and fair elections, transparency of government, et cetera?
I don't think except in maybe certain circumstances, I don't think they don't understand. I think it's true that they can get, manipulated by propaganda. But the thing is, authoritarians tell them that democracy is a sham. Like just the other day, Putin said liberal democracy is dead. It's dying. And every one of them says this. And they believe that true freedom comes with another system. So in our country, you see Trump keeps saying that he's the protector of free speech, for example, on campuses. I'm a university professor, so I pay attention to those issues. And free speech means allowing, far right, they call alt-right, but it's really far right extremists to speak on campus. And it's opening up the mainstreaming of very dangerous ideologies. So this kind of freedom, authoritarian notion of freedom, means the destruction of democracy, but some people already feel left out. And in Trump's America, the whole idea of the forgotten, that Trump takes care of the forgotten people
right,
who Obama neglected. And this is very powerful,
sure,
and it works.
Yeah, we see it working all the time. Let's just talk a little bit about media and control of or repression of free and fair press. Trump has probably been more effective at that than almost any other one thing with the advent of, fake news. You've got Kellyanne Conway's alternative facts, and then he has so many in the media, the people who are at least on television and radio are listened to the most, that are his sycophants on Fox News, and Rush Limbaugh, and many others on the radio and internet. We should always include, by the way, the internet shows because there are so many of them as well. What did Mussolini do? What did Hitler do? What is Bolsonaro or Putin or Orban doing? Pick anyone you want in terms of what they did to manipulate or discredit journalism.
So the big difference is, in historical dictatorships in the 20th century, you had a total shutdown of the free press. So you only had one voice, and you had anchored by the personality cult of the leader. And so in fascist Italy, there was the slogan, Mussolini is always right. So whatever he said, whatever crazy thing, made up statistic, he's always right. So he's like, that goes back to the God-like thing. And so you only had regime press. You had many kinds of press and, different currents within it, some more hardline, some less, but any opposition voice was banished. In the 21st century, if we take Putin, he allows some opposition to exist. He poisons people, sometimes with a warning dose of poison, but he finds it, because in the 21st century, it's a little more difficult if you're not a one-party state to pull off the complete shutdown of a free press. So all these guys, Erdogan, et cetera, they ban Wikipedia, they want their own internet, but they leave a little pocket of opposition. And Trump's doing something unique with Fox News. It's different because before, the press, let's say with Mussolini, the press would just parrot what he said, right? And every speech he did would be, we didn't have the internet then, but it was circulated in a million ways, like photographs, slogans, there were graffiti on walls that were regime graffiti. So everything circulated through the public sphere, even without the internet. But what Trump does is that with Fox News, they don't just parrot him, they actually give him the ideas too, because Trump is less intelligent and more TV addicted than any other ruler.
Yeah, it's such a really good point that doesn't get made enough. And it's interesting when you make it with the historical point of view, so much more interesting because, and he isn't intelligent or creative enough. And so it's not, so there's a state media that we can talk about with, countries in like China or North Korea. And then you can talk about it from the historical point. It's state run. And in this case, Fox News is giving him the talking points, is giving him the narrative and the arguments and the conspiracies. He doesn't get them from his government. He doesn't get them from his intel agencies or Republicans in Congress. He gets them from Hannity. He gets them from Tucker Carlson, from Rush Limbaugh, and then he uses them. Is that what you're saying? That's what I see.
So he's an amplifier, and then every time I will not retweet him. I did in 2018. I published a op-ed for the Washington Post called "How to Push Back Against Trump's Propaganda Machine," giving some tips. One of them is you don't retweet Trump because you're just amplifying his crap, and you need to take his oxygen away. It's a futile recommendation, but I'm doing it anyway.
No, I think I agree because people like me will retweet it with an insult or a joke. But the truth is that will get to people who don't like you, your insult or your joke, and they'll maybe see his tweet for the first time. So they
do. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, but Trump's really the TV thing's very interesting because he really, all the other rulers are quite intelligent. They're overrated, but they are intelligent and they read strategy. Trump gets everything from TV. So that's why he retweets like pictures of himself as Rambo, because he doesn't, other leaders, like if they want to seem like macho icons of their country, sometimes they like associate themselves with past rulers. Like Bolsonaro's always like talking about the military dictatorship, right? To scare people. Or Putin is like putting up statues of Stalin. So Trump, partly because we've been a democracy, but partly because he's just, again, all he has in his head is TV. He does like Game of Thrones and he does Rambo.
Right. He does memes, but what about in the past you had people, or currently you have like the leader of North Korea riding the horse. You see Putin shirtless and playing hockey. Trump isn't actually physically strong. He's physically weak. He's never sweat or probably worked or bled. And so he has to have photoshopped images of him actually appearing strong. And you could also, I suppose, argue, Gaddafi and others in military uniforms, which makes them look strong. He just uses Photoshop, it seems. He doesn't use it.
That's a great point. I'm making that point because a lot of my book has a chapter on masculinity, And Trump has to use other people's bodies, as you just said, because he's not athletic, and he
looks like a sack of potatoes, and he would never appear shirtless because he doesn't do any kind of exercise. He doesn't take care of himself at all. Yeah, well, given that, and I know you've written about this as well. Why aren't there strong women in the past, or are there? I mean, how come we don't see more authoritarian women? Is that just a simple gender equation that we don't see women as strong, even though by measures of pain, I always like to say women are a lot stronger than men?
Yeah, no, there certainly have been a ton of strong women rulers. They're not in my book because people like Golda Meir of Israel or Indira Gandhi, India, Margaret Thatcher, to be in my book, you have to have destroyed democracy or be. It's a select club to be in the process of destroying democracy. And one very interesting thing, though, is in the future, there will be authoritarian female leaders. It's just that the culture of authoritarianism is very masculine dominated. So the only women from an earlier generation who got prominent to lead their movement is like Le Pen in France, because her father started the National Front. So she was already there from being the daughter. But in the future, like there's a lot of prominent women in the German far right, some in the Italian far right. And there's Ivanka Trump, who wants to be president and may be one day, which is a horrific idea, but it really could happen.
What about the idea? I mean, we both kind of said, and I think agree, that Trump isn't that intelligent by measures of political strategy, one might argue. And what I mean by that, and I think in a way we're really lucky. How does his political strategy compare to the political strategy of other authoritarian leaders, including those now? Because he doesn't seem, what I mean by that is he doesn't play the long game. He just lives for today's tweet, to hurt somebody today, because so much of his strategy backfires on him, and I think we're lucky for it. Am I right about that? He doesn't play the long game. He doesn't have strategy. And is it accurate to say that others have and currently do?
That kind of goes to the eternal question. And I would say, in my opinion, you're half right. He is very impulsive. He can be self-destructive. He gets distracted and tweets for the moment. But if you look at what he is quiet about, for example, you could say, he has no filter, right? But he never, ever tweets anything bad about Putin. He never tweets anything that he doesn't want revealed, like his financial information. And he has a long game. He wanted to be president for many, many years. He talked to Steve Bannon in 2010 about running for president. He has a strategy, and he's actually done a huge amount of damage. He's been very consistent with his racism, with his promotion of white nationalism, with his love of authoritarian leaders. He's never been out of, his misogyny. So I actually see, I don't know if strategy is the right word, but I see a plan. And that's just a question that, like, people, if you read the books of people who worked in the White House with them, they say it's like John Kelly said, it's quote, crazy town. Mattis said it's like a fifth grade classroom. So it's chaos. But if you take the long view, it's remarkable how much continuity he's had on the things he cares about, like being a racist and keeping non-white people in cages or out of the country.
What about the question of loyalty? His insatiable need for loyalty is what you wrote. Duty over country. How does that compare to history as authoritarians? Because it's really fascinating. I saw you make this point about how many people come in and out of those important positions. You just mentioned that, one of his chiefs of staff, what is he on, 3 or 4? Secretaries of state. This is very uncommon, and the reason why he replaces them is always fascinating as well. And then, of course, just the bizarre notion that any American would be okay with the mayor of their town allowing their son or daughter to have a job in the town hall, much less a governor, much less a president. Somehow the fact that we allow his Donald Trump's daughter and daughter-in-law to be in the highest positions is extremely unique. That was never okay almost anywhere. Loyalty.
It's like in far as that goes, it's like with a toddler. You have to, if you need to discipline them right away, and show them that this was not right. If you don't do anything, then logically they think it's okay. So Trump knows that we didn't do anything early on. And this is how all these authoritarians who started in democracies got started. They pushed the envelope and then nothing happens. So they say, okay, well, that means I can go further. The loyalty stuff, they all behave the same way. And in fact, what Trump does with his ever-changing cabinet and his ritual humiliation of the people he works with, unfortunately, this is exactly the same as Mussolini, as Hitler, as Gaddafi. All of them treat their subordinates the same way. And I didn't expect to find that, but I did. Doesn't mean the outcome's the same. We're not going to have a fascist dictatorship or a military coup right now. But the way he is as a leader with this insatiable loyalty, as I wrote, it is the same character trait as they had.
All right, last question, but the biggest and most important question, which of course is, how does this end? You have studied these regimes throughout history, and they always end. Is that fair to say? They always end?
Eventually they end. The luckiest ones get to die in their native country and not have charges against them. That's pretty rare. A lot of them have to go into exile. But those are people who came to power like illegally, like a military coup, let's say, or had a dictatorship. What happens now is it's harder to get rid of them. Look at Putin. He's been in power almost 20 years. Once they come in, if they come in with elections and they fix elections, it's really hard to get rid of them. And with Trump, when Michael Cohen said, testifying, this is former lawyer who knows him extremely well, that Trump's not going to leave office. He can't, because he's got such a good gig going to be corrupt, right? And he needs the immunity and all the other things. So I agree with him. I don't think he's going to leave. He's going to make sure that he's reelected one way or the other. I hope that's not true. However, that said, history also shows that if you mobilize to compensate for voter suppression and for election trickery, you can get rid of rulers. This happened to Pinochet in 1990. He had to leave. In 1989, he had to leave office because there was a huge mobilization of civil society to vote against him.
And do you see that happening? You're working with this organization, Protect Democracy. There's a whole bunch of really important, interesting, similar organizations to try to make sure we don't have voter suppression. Obviously, election security is a really important thing, but this guy will do whatever it takes to cheat and win too.
He will. I hope that Americans will come to see this as so urgent that they have to devote at least an hour a day, every day, or more, to protecting democracy, or else it won't have the mass action that it needs. So it's possible if it can become a priority. And here, I say this sometimes, our tradition of democracy, and we take it for granted, is a liability in this situation. The reason, because people say, well, everywhere in the world, people are protesting, millions of people out in Santiago and, of course, in Hong Kong, because those countries know what they're going to lose. They either had it in the past or they have it right now. And we don't really have a sense of that. We have the civil rights movement. They certainly fought for their liberty, but on a national scale, we're not equipped to understand the urgency in a sense. Such
a really important point. The vast majority of Americans really don't understand that because they've had, pretty good opportunities probably most of our lives. Wow. I've really enjoyed reading your stuff and preparing to talk to you, but not as much as I enjoyed actually talking to you and being in your class. Thanks for being our professor here. And I look forward to talking to you again. I highly recommend everybody goes and reads everything that Ruth has been writing. When does your new book come out?
Probably early 2021, so not for a while.
All right. Well, I'll let you get back to work on that and everything else that you're doing, and I hope to check in with you again. Thank you so much, Ruth. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Well, that was pretty interesting. Ruth Ben Ghiat. Definitely follow her on Twitter. Tell her you heard her on the podcast. Let her and all of our guests know that you heard them here, that you're listening, and so we can certainly get them back on the show. And thank you. Thank you for listening the last 2 months. It's been really, really amazing and challenging transition for me, but I really am happy with where the podcast is at and where we are going. Excited for 2020. Sign up if you haven't already on Patreon for a paid subscription. That'll go a long way. Some people are paying $5, $10, $25, $50. A couple people are paying $100 on the Patreon, and I could not be more grateful for your generosity. Hopefully you're learning as much as I am from these excellent guests that have been joining us. And I will be in South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, the Charleston Comedy Festival. If you know anybody in Charleston, check it out. That is January 18th, one show. So I hope to see you or somebody you know there. Spread the word about that. And we will talk to you on, what day is it? Friday, right here on Stand Up, the Stand Up with Pete Dominick podcast. Give us a rating, give us a review, and we'll talk to you then. Thank you.